I built my entire life around one quiet rule. Don't make things worse. That was it. No drama. No confrontation. No raised voices. No irreversible words. If there was tension, I softened it. If there was disagreement, I found the middle. If someone was unhappy, I adjusted. I thought that made me mature. 10 seconds into this confession, here's the truth I never said out loud: I didn't lose my life because I chose wrong. I lost it because I refused to choose it all. From the outside, I was easy to be around. Calm. Reasonable. Flexible. People trusted me because I never pushed back too hard. I listened. I compromised. I kept things smooth. What no one noticed, what I didn't notice for a long time, was how much of myself disappeared in that smoothness. I learned early that conflict has consequences. Someone gets hurt. Someone leaves. Something breaks. I watched it happen around me and decided, quietly, that I would be different. I would be the person who kept things together. So I swallowed words. I delayed conversations. I chose peace over honesty so many times it stopped feeling like a choice. I told myself I was being kind. I wasn't. I was being careful. Every relationship I had followed the same pattern. At first, things felt easy. I adapted quickly. I made space. I avoided friction. People felt understood around me. Over time, something shifted. They felt comfortable. I felt invisible. I noticed it first in small ways. Preferences I never stated because it didn't matter. Opinions I softened until they meant nothing. Boundaries I blurred because enforcing them felt rude. I became fluent in avoiding discomfort. The problem is, discomfort doesn't disappear when you avoid it. It relocates. It moves inward. I started feeling tired in a way rest couldn't touch. Not burned out. Hollowed out. Like I was constantly holding something back without knowing what it was. People described me as easygoing. I smiled when they said it. Inside, I felt erased. The hardest part was that nothing was obviously wrong. My life worked. Relationships stayed intact. No one accused me of anything. I was never the problem. And that made it impossible to justify the emptiness. How do you explain that you feel lost when you've done everything right? I remember one moment clearly. Someone asked me what I wanted, not abstractly, not someday, right now. The question landed heavier than it should have. I opened my mouth and felt panic. Not because I didn't know the answer. Because I had trained myself not to have one. Wanting something meant risking disagreement. Risking disappointment. Risking being seen as difficult. So I laughed it off. Said it didn't matter. Let the moment pass. But it didn't pass. It stayed with me. I began to realize how much of my identity was built around being agreeable. How my sense of self depended on not upsetting anyone. How often I chose silence not because it was right, but because it was safe. Conflict avoidance feels moral until you see its cost. It cost me clarity. It cost me desire. It cost me direction. I lived in a constant state of adjustment, always calibrating myself to the room. Over time, I lost track of where I ended and others began. I didn't know how to say, "This is not okay for me," without apologizing. I didn't know how to want something without justifying it. I didn't know how to be present without scanning for tension. My life became quiet. Too quiet. The first time I considered that avoiding conflict might actually be the problem, I resisted the idea immediately. It felt wrong. Selfish. Dramatic. Good people don't create friction, I told myself. But good people also don't disappear inside their own lives. I started noticing something disturbing. The more peaceful my life became on the surface, the more restless I felt underneath. Like something essential was being held underwater, gasping quietly, unseen. I wasn't angry. I was muted. That scared me more than anger ever could. Because anger demands resolution. Muted lives just continue. I began to understand that by avoiding conflict with others, I had been in constant conflict with myself. one I never acknowledged, never resolved. And that conflict was slowly winning. I didn't know yet how to change. I didn't even know what changing would look like. I only knew this: if I kept choosing peace over truth, I would eventually have nothing left worth protecting. The first real conflict didn't arrive dramatically. It slipped in quietly, disguised as a moment I could have handled the old way. Someone crossed a line. Not maliciously. Casually. The kind of moment that usually earns a polite smile and a silent adjustment. The kind I had navigated my entire life without leaving a trace. I felt the familiar reflex rise in me: soften it, minimize it, keep things calm. And then something strange happened. I felt tired of disappearing. Not angry. Not offended. Just deeply, completely exhausted by my own silence. I hesitated for a second too long, and in that pause, I felt the weight of every moment I had swallowed before. Every time I had said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. Every time I had chosen harmony over honesty and called it maturity. So I did something small and terrifying. I said, "That doesn't work for me." The words felt heavy in my mouth. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Just clear. The reaction was immediate: surprise, discomfort, a subtle tightening in the air. Nothing exploded. No one yelled. But the room changed. And for the first time, I was inside that change instead of smoothing it away. I went home shaken, replaying the moment over and over. Part of me wanted to apologize, to undo it, to restore the familiar calm. I had broken the unspoken rule: don't make things awkward. But another part of me, quieter, steadier, felt something else. Relief. Not joy. Relief. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. It didn't last. Conflict, once allowed, doesn't politely limit itself to one appearance. It invites others. I began noticing how many areas of my life were built on quiet concessions. Arrangements I had never agreed with. Roles I had accepted by default. Expectations I had never questioned because questioning them felt like betrayal. Each time I considered speaking up, the same fears surfaced. They'll think I've changed. They'll pull away. I'll lose what little stability I have. Those fears weren't imagined. Some of them came true. The more honest I became, the less comfortable things felt. Conversations grew tense. Some people reacted with confusion, others with irritation. A few with disappointment that cut deeper than anger ever could. I learned quickly that people who benefit from your silence rarely applaud your voice. That hurt. Not because they were wrong, but because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to see. Some of my relationships had been built on my avoidance, not on mutual understanding. As conflict increased, so did guilt. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. Every boundary felt like cruelty. Every honest no felt like abandonment. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I was overreacting, becoming selfish, manufacturing problems where none existed. But beneath the guilt was something new. Clarity. I could finally feel where I ended. The inner conflict grew louder too. Not between me and others, between who I had been and who I was becoming. The old voice told me I was ruining everything, that peace was worth any personal cost. The new one asked a harder question. Peace for whom? I realized I had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of connection. I had believed that if no one was upset, things were good. But good relationships don't require one person to vanish. As I started choosing honesty more often, something else became impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to fight. Not in a destructive way, in a healthy one. I had no practice expressing disagreement without collapsing into guilt or defensiveness. Every conflict felt like proof I was doing something wrong. That made the process messy. I said things imperfectly. Sometimes too bluntly. Sometimes too late. I watched myself stumble into conversations I had avoided for years and felt clumsy, exposed, unskilled. Growth wasn't graceful. It was awkward. There were nights I missed the old version of myself. The calm one. The agreeable one. The one who never made waves and was rarely alone. Life had been simpler when I didn't insist on existing fully. But it had also been smaller. I began to understand that avoiding conflict hadn't made me kind. It had made me unclear. And unclear lives accumulate resentment the way damp rooms grow mold, slowly, invisibly, until the structure is compromised. I wasn't fighting others anymore. I was fighting the habit of erasing myself to keep things quiet. And I could feel that this fight was heading towards something unavoidable. A choice. Not between conflict and peace. Between disappearance and presence. The decisive conflict wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic exit. It was a conversation I had postponed for years because I knew, instinctively, that once it happened, something would be lost forever. Not the relationship itself. The version of it that required me to stay silent. I went into that conversation calm on the surface and terrified underneath. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't prepare arguments. I knew from experience that preparation was just another way to control the outcome. This time, I needed to let it be real. I said what I needed. Not perfectly. Not gently enough. But honestly. I named things I had minimized for years. I admitted how often I had agreed when I didn't. How often I had chosen peace at my own expense. How much resentment had grown in the quiet. The response was exactly what I had feared. Discomfort. Defensiveness. Then distance. Not immediately, but unmistakably. I watched understanding drain from the room and be replaced by something colder. Not anger. Reassessment. As if the person across from me was recalculating who I was and deciding whether this new version was still acceptable. That's when I understood something painful. Some connections survive honesty. Others survive only silence. This one couldn't do both. I left that conversation knowing it was the last time I would be seen the same way. I felt grief, sharp, immediate grief, for something familiar and safe that was now gone. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And for a moment, I almost went back. I stood there afterward, alone, and felt the old instinct surge. Apologize. Explain. Take it back. Restore the balance. Make things comfortable again. I had done it 100 times before. This time, I didn't. I let the loss stand. The days that followed were quiet in a different way. Not the numb quiet of suppression, the exposed quiet of change. Some people pulled away completely. Others kept their distance, unsure how to interact with someone who no longer smoothed every edge. I felt lonely. Deeply. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years. Grounded. For the first time, my internal and external lives matched. The tension between who I was and how I behaved began to dissolve. I wasn't constantly adjusting myself to fit the room. I wasn't scanning for conflict to neutralize. I was present. Presence, I learned, is not comfortable at first. It costs you people. It costs you certainty. It costs you the illusion of being universally liked. But it gives you something far more dangerous. A life that answers back. I began to notice how much energy I had spent avoiding friction. How much of my anxiety had come not from conflict itself, but from the constant anticipation of it. Once I stopped running, the fear lost its grip. I still dislike conflict. That didn't change. What changed was my relationship to it. I no longer see it as failure. I see it as information. A signal that something matters enough to be named. A boundary being tested. A truth asking to be spoken. Some relationships didn't recover. I grieved them honestly this time, without pretending they had been perfect. I could see clearly now that their stability had required my absence. Losing them hurt, but keeping them would have cost me myself. I also noticed something unexpected. The people who stayed began relating to me differently. Not more smoothly, more directly. Conversations were messy, but real. Disagreements happened, and the world didn't end. I wasn't erased for having an opinion. I learned, slowly, how to tolerate tension without collapsing or retreating. How to let discomfort exist without fixing it. How to trust that connection doesn't require constant harmony. Looking back, I don't see my old life as a mistake. I see it as incomplete. Avoiding conflict didn't make me peaceful. It made me hollow. Peace that requires your silence is not peace. It's maintenance. I didn't become aggressive. I didn't become cruel. I didn't become someone who enjoys confrontation. I became someone who can exist inside it. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the one who smooths, adjusts, absorbs, and disappears to keep things calm, I won't tell you to start fights. I'll tell you this. Every conflict you avoid doesn't disappear. It relocates, into your body, your fatigue, your resentment, your sense of self. And one day, you wake up and realize you've been at war with yourself the entire time. I avoided every conflict for most of my life. And I still lost my peace. The moment I stopped avoiding it, I didn't gain comfort. I gained myself. And that, quietly, imperfectly, was worth everything it cost.